Hey, how's it going? Today I wanted to talk about whether human beings are still evolving or not. Sort of feels like we should be, but it also sort of feels like things are different now that we're a technological civilization. We're not even in the food chain anymore, surely that affects something, right? Are we getting dumber instead? It certainly feels like it sometimes. Or are we just a larval form for a hyper-intelligent post-human civilization? Good question, let's talk about it. Okay, so before we start talking about what evolution's doing, it would probably be a good idea to understand what evolution actually is. Now, in my experience, a lot of people seem to think that if there's a part of a human body that isn't really being used as much anymore, that means we're going to evolve to not have it. But that's not quite how evolution really works. For example, humans have a tailbone. It's not really useful for anything at this point. It's just the vestigial remnant of our ancestors who used to have tails, and it's basically just a piece of bone at the end of your spine that breaks if you sit down too hard. Seems like a design flaw, right? Seems like, if it's already been shrinking, it's the kind of thing that's going to go away sooner or later. You can make similar arguments for the appendix, ear muscles, goosebumps, wisdom teeth. We don't need any of these things, but crucially, just because we don't need them doesn't mean that evolution is automatically going to get rid of them. See, evolution happens via natural selection. Natural selection being nature selecting who gets to pass on their genetic information. In order to pass on your genetic information, there's two things you need to do. You need to survive. I am happy and healthy. And you need to procreate. I just got laid. The thing is that evolution happens due to selection pressure. The selection part being that some animals get to do those things and some animals don't, right? If you're a monkey who's terrible at surviving, who was born with both of his lungs on the outside of his body and only wants to fuck grapefruits, you are probably not passing on your genetic information, so there's going to be less things like you in the future. Whereas, if you're healthy, survive a long time, are attractive to other mates, and produce offspring which are also healthy and live long enough to be attractive to mates when they sexually mature, all of that paints a picture of an animal being successful in the natural selection game. Animals like that get to pass on their genetic information. So there's two games being played. There's being sexually fit, where, and presuming that we're talking about species that reproduce sexually here, the other sex wants to have sex with you. And then there's fitness in terms of, yes, physical health, but really fitness in this context more means fit for your environment. Like, if a white mouse lives on grey rocks, and there's birds of prey that live nearby and try and swoop down and catch the mice that they see, that white mouse is going to stand out a lot. But if there's a grey mouse, it's not going to stand out as much. So the white ones are going to get picked off, and the grey ones are going to survive. So when people say survival of the fittest, they often don't quite use that term correctly. Fittest means fit for the environment that it lives in. That's what allows it to survive, and surviving is the only situation where you get to pass on your genetic information, right? If all the white mice die out and only the grey ones survive, that species has evolved. They're all grey now, because those are the only ones that are left to do the fucking. So that's how certain traits get selected out of a species. But how do we get new traits and new species? Well, if two people fuck the shit out of each other very much and make a disgusting, screaming, crying, farting baby, that baby is going to be a hodgepodge of both of their DNA. Roughly 50% father and 50% mother. It's not the same 50% each time though. It doesn't like select 50% in a big chunk. It kind of randomly scrambles roughly 50% from each parent. This is why you and your siblings look kind of similar, but with different bits and pieces kind of taken from both of your parents. One of you will probably look a bit more like your dad, one will probably look a bit more like your mum. You know, John has his mum's eyes and his dad's jawline, and Kenneth has his mum's knees and his dad's foreskin or whatever. Anyway, that's only half the story, because if that were the only thing that were happening, we'd all eventually just look homogenous. The missing ingredient is genetic mutations, so when your mum and your dad's genetics combine, they don't combine perfectly, it fucks up a little bit every time it does it. These are called genetic mutations, and every time a mutation occurs, one of four things can happen. Either there's no effect at all on the baby, which is usually what happens because there's kind of redundancy built into our genetic information so that every single tiny little tweak doesn't mean that there's now an ankle growing out of our ear or something weird. Or you can have some change happen, but it doesn't really do anything that important, like your eyes are a different color, or your hands are a slightly different size or something. Basically just something innocuous that doesn't really matter either way. Or you can get something that does produce a big change, and statistically speaking, if it's changing something, it's probably going to fuck something up. Something that we would basically consider a disability that occurs through a genetic mutation. Just by the nature of how genetic mutations work, there's a huge number of different possible syndromes and stuff that people can have as a result of basically random chance every time someone gets pregnant. And then probably the least likely outcome is that you have a genetic mutation that turns out to actually be a good thing. It actually helps you survive and or makes you more attractive to mates. Imagine there's a small species of flightless bird, and it's a prey species, so it's being hunted by other animals, and it runs in kind of a goofy way where it's like flapping its arms, but it doesn't actually fly. But hypothetically, imagine one member of this species ends up with a mutation that puts a few more feathers on its wings, and now it can actually just about get airborne, and it's actually able to get away from the predators slightly more effectively than all the other members of its species. It's going to be the one that survives, right? So it's very likely to pass on that mutation. So you're likely to get more animals with that trait, trait, and eventually either the entire species ends up with that trait because it's just better, or you end up with two divergent populations of the species living in different areas where some of them have that new mutation and some of them don't. Keep those populations isolated for long enough and eventually they become two new different species because enough mutations have happened that eventually they're so different from each other that they can't interbreed anymore. Anyway, that's basically evolution via natural selection. The question is that still happening to humans? Well, we can answer that question by basically asking, are there still human selection pressures? And yeah, there are. They're not necessarily quite as life and death as they used to be, but they are still there. People still prefer attractive traits to unattractive traits, even if they're not objectively better and it's just some kind of cultural thing. If we act on those things consistently over long enough periods of time, they will eventually affect how we look evolutionarily, because it will act as a selection pressure on who gets to breed and who doesn't get to breed. Although admittedly that is kind of an oversimplified way of looking at it. You know, additional factors like using contraception and stuff like that do heavily influence the results of what we're thinking about. So it's not as easy as just saying people who most people find attractive will be what humans will look like in the future. That's not really how it's actually going to work, but it might influence things to some degree. Also, there are still plenty of inheritable diseases or genetic mutations that can either kill you or render you heavily disabled or otherwise just unable to have children. But a lot of the stuff that would have killed people before is the kind of thing that we can just sort of work around now, given the state of human technology. I mean, even something as simple as a wheelchair is absolutely life-changing for a shitload of people. If you didn't have two functioning legs 25,000 years ago, you definitely would be being eaten by a tiger, unfortunately. I mean, hey, I wouldn't be here either if it weren't for technology. Both me and my older brother were in this position before we were born. We were also freakishly large. It doesn't take a genius to see that a natural birth with those factors involved is not gonna end well. Anyway, my point is that things that would normally kill people before don't necessarily kill you now, and that prevents those things from being a selection pressure on our species. Now, obviously, human beings haven't been a technological civilization for that long, evolutionarily speaking, so it's a little hard to predict whether that's not going to be much of an issue or whether it's going to be an absolute disaster for humans going forward. But if it is a disaster, we also have technology which we could use to make it not a disaster anymore. There's kind of a back and forth with this. We live in cities and we're not getting hunted by animals, so we don't need to be well adapted to our environment anymore because we just change our environment to fit whatever fucked up homunculus bodies we have. That's kind of the weird inversion that human beings have done using technology. We're not subservient to the environment anymore. The environment is subservient to us. But you could kind of imagine that, I don't know, in 100,000 years' time, are all human beings going to be these weird gelatinous blobs that can't look after themselves because we just keep adapting the environment around us so that any genetic mutations that take place don't kill all of us off and don't even lower our quality of life? Well, I don't quite think so. And the reason is that when people talk about the future of human evolution, I think people tend to focus on one aspect or another too much. What I just touched on was humans changing their environment and having technology to compensate for things that would normally kill us. But that is just one way in which our situation currently is different from all the other animals that have ever existed on the planet. But there's actually several other ways that matter, and you have to consider all these different aspects if you want the answer to accurately reflect the reality that we're moving towards. So beyond just environmentally compensating for genetic mutations, there are two really important technological branches that are going to massively influence the reality of whether humans are still evolving or not. And these two things are genetic engineering and cybernetic augmentation. Sorry to interrupt, this is just a quick message to say, statistically speaking, you're probably not subscribed, so I'll make you a deal. Press the subscribe button and I won't come over to your house and do this. Alright, thanks, back to the video. Cybernetic augmentation involves still having a kid naturally. You know, you cook them up and fart them out on normal mode. But during the life of this person, they get additional technological components attached to or integrated into their physiology. Now, that could be as simple as having a prosthetic arm or a prosthetic leg if you've lost your arm or leg, but it could also be actually removing your biological arm or leg because you want to replace it with a synthetic one. In this category, we'd also have things like brain chips, this Neuralink kind of stuff that lets you control computers with thoughts alone. There doesn't need to be a physical interface between you and the machine, or, well, technically there is a physical interface, but that physical interface is hardwired directly into your brain, so it wouldn't subjectively feel like there's a physical interface. That technology could even allow for a type of telepathy. The chip you have implanted in your brain and the chip that someone else has implanted in their brain could communicate with each other without you having to verbally speak to each other. There's definitely a lot of utopian and dystopian use cases for that, and this is reality, so we're probably heading slightly more towards the dystopian end of things. But regardless, the key point with cybernetics is that it's something that you do to a biologically normal person, right? You're a regular flesh and blood human being, and you're bolting extra pieces to your natural anatomy. DNA. Which means if you and someone else have a kid together, even if you are both heavily cybernetically augmented, that kid will still just be a regular human when they come out, right? You could have robotic arms and legs and some insane Dr. Octopus bullshit going on. Still, if you and someone else fuck, the kid that you're gonna have is not gonna come out with a bunch of augmentations. They're gonna be a natural human being. Which means even if we do use cybernetic augmentations as a type of treatment for people, if they're suffering as the result of some kind of mutation that's happened or some hereditary disease, maybe someone's legs don't work properly, but they get cybernetic legs and then they can move around perfectly fine. If anything, that does actually move us closer to the type of reality I was initially describing, where natural human physiology becomes less strictly kept in line by natural selection. But that's only going to happen to the degree that we're able to fix that with augmentations. If it gets to the point where cybernetics can't even fix the situation, then natural selection will come into play again. But it could end up in a scenario where you might imagine 1,000,000 years from now, our descendants are born and they're completely helpless, even in adulthood. They just don't have a physical body that works right, and they have to be augmented in order to be able to live life normally. And you might imagine in a scenario like that, it would become a very deeply culturally ingrained thing that you immediately get cybernetics as soon as you're born, or it becomes some key coming of age type of ritual. Anyway, that's the cybernetic side of things, which could be very heavily influential on how human life is actually lived, but what it's not is us directly fiddling with natural evolution. Genetic engineering is us directly fiddling with natural evolution. Imagine if two people contribute their reproductive cells and they're combined to make a zygote, and then presuming that we have a full understanding of the human genetic code and we can edit individual nucleotides and do it quick enough that we can change the entire genome to be exactly what we want it to be, theoretically you could completely genetically engineer an entire person to be exactly the way that you want them to be, at least insofar as things that you can affect genetically, which is most things about an organism. Like the difference between a human and a dolphin is ultimately our genetics, or at least you can reduce it to genetics. You could essentially build a dolphin from scratch if you put all of its genes together in the right order within a cell that's going to divide properly. I may be vastly oversimplifying this, but you get the general point. So this is categorically different from cybernetics because in one sense it's more limited. Cybernetically, you could give a person wheels. I'm not sure if you could do that genetically. I think probably not. Well, maybe. I mean, okay, a jetpack, right? You could, theoretically, you could give someone rocket boosters cybernetically. You can't do that genetically, but genetically, you could essentially code a zygote so that it's as intelligent and healthy and blah 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 as you want it to be, and whatever changes you make are going to roll over into the next generation, right? That's going to affect the reproductive cells that this person has when they're grown up, so they're going to pass those on to the next generation, which obviously comes with a lot of ethical concerns. I'm fairly confident that we are going to end up doing genetic engineering, just like we're going to end up doing cybernetic engineering as well. So it'll be interesting to see how we navigate this problem, because what we don't want is all the rich people having kids with 140 IQ plus, and they're all athletes, and they're all beautiful, and they're all whatever, and then everyone else in society not only is poorer, but is also essentially disabled by comparison. Like, that would be a horrific outcome. At the same time, if we have the capability to do this, and let's say that you're 2 or 3 months pregnant, and you find out that your fetus is going to be born with some condition, they've got some inherited disease, or they've got some genetic mutation that's going to render them disabled in some way, or really I should say, it's going to render their quality of life less than it otherwise would have been, right? It's going to affect their well-being in a negative way. Different people come to different conclusions on this, but honestly, I would argue that if we have the ability to make it so that their life is going to be less shitty, we're kind of obligated to do so. Like, imagine if your parents found out that you were going to be born with no arms and no legs, but it was early enough that they could do some genetic engineering bullshit and actually fix it, and then they just chose not to do that. I'd be fucking livid. Like, it's one thing when that happens now and, shit happens, we can't really do anything about it, but it's a totally different situation if it's fixable. I mean, it's effectively voluntary at that point. Like, I understand when people say that genetic engineering is essentially just a form of eugenics. That's not an irrational thing to be concerned about. Like, this could go in some really weird and fucked up directions, and I do have some sympathies with that point of view, but also on some level I kind of think about it similarly to how I think about vaccines. Like, if you have a kid and the kid dies of a preventable illness because you didn't want to give them the vaccine because you watched a bunch of podcasts that told you that Bill Gates puts microchips in them or some stupid shit, I'm just like, alright, this kid just died for no reason. It's not funny. I don't know, it seems kind of unfair to have the kid's life be in the hands of whatever stupid parents they've got, as opposed to it just being a blanket thing that everyone gets. I think that's my take. Either everyone should get genetic engineering, or no one should get genetic engineering. It's easy to say that, not sure how we enforce that, but, whatever. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone gets to have a kid that's healthy and doesn't have anything wrong with them, and probably nothing on top of that. I think it does go in a pretty bad direction once you start going, oh, my kid needs to have blue eyes, or whatever, like that. Just the floodgates open for a variety of super super mega turbo eugenics and all that kind of stupid shit. You know, one moment a mother wants a child with blonde hair, and a few years later people are giving birth to giant man-eating lobsters. Anyway, the culmination of both of these things is how they end up bouncing off of each other over time, particularly over the long span of time. What happens if we want certain capabilities that we can only get by augmenting ourselves with technology, but those augmentations only work if we also genetically engineer ourselves to be able to receive those augmentations? So even though the course of human evolution can only be affected directly by genetic engineering and not cybernetic engineering, you could have both of these things kind of working together over time to essentially create kind of a new organism. What if people don't get pregnant anymore? What if we grow humans in vats? What if part of that process becomes not only growing fetuses from genetic information, which themselves have been edited and engineered in various ways, but also what if cybernetic enhancements become an integral part of growing a human being from scratch? What if we change things on such a drastic level that DNA isn't even natural DNA anymore? Like, there are other molecules that hypothetical alien creatures could use in place of DNA that would do essentially the same job as DNA. What if somehow we find out that there's some benefit of using some other option and we essentially transition to it? I mean, in the limit case, we could essentially evolve into creatures which don't even really use biological material anymore. Maybe new weird compound materials that we would regard as synthetic actually become the substrate that new human beings are made out of in the really long-term future. Something legitimately post-human could come out of this whole process, which is pretty insane to think about. I mean, who knows, we might end up embedding human intelligence directly into some kind of virtual environment or something. Shit could get pretty goddamn weird in the far future. So, is humanity still evolving? Yes, but where that goes exactly is ultimately up to us to decide. Let me know in the comments what kind of horrendous fucked up abomination you'd like to be. And as always, thanks to my elite level supporters: Thunderbolt 22A10, who evolved from protoplasm I found in my basement; Nomad Greg, who just killed Chuck Norris; Andrew Mole, who doesn't have a genome, he has a G-dwarf; John Bejarano, who can take out a man's spine and put it back in upside down; JDK, who was born in a cave; Mutantious Doom, who's actually just one giant undifferentiated cell; Stormester Ritter, who's known in his homeland as the Great Dark One; Nikita Lurie, who's mastered the art of having an aneurysm; Aaron Rowe, who was designed in the Spore character creator; Bonk Chunk, who has the Guinness record for most torsos; That One Boy, who has the superpower of being able to read people's minds, which will be very useful as soon as he learns how to read; Trenton Caldwell, whose DNA is the key to solving the magician's code; and thanks to all my other supporters too. Don't forget to join the Patreon or the channel membership if you want to be featured in my video credits or chat on Discord, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one. Over and out.